I was not necessarily planning to discuss Pokemon Legends ZA, even though I think it is a solid game. I think being able to battle Pokemon like they do in the anime is quite a pleasant experience, though whether it is in long term better than the turn-based battles is something I have very mixed feelings about. I really don't think all RPGs need to abandon the turn-based format. But what really fascinates me about this game as an urban planning aficionado is how the transformation of Lumiose, which is very clearly based on Paris, in the game mirrors one of the most spectacular urban planning transformations of any city in the last 20 years, that being the transformation of Paris in the late 2010s into the 2020s into being one of the most ecologically aware and sustainable and really 21st century cities in the world. Now, I of course have always adored Paris. It's my favorite city in the world. And perhaps I do view it a bit idealistically. The best week of my life was the week I spent one Thanksgiving in Paris, late November 2016. That meant more than me than I can say, but from an urban planning perspective, Paris, despite being this ancient European city and thus being very walkable, bikeable, and having great transit by the standards of most of the world, was still very much a place with a lot of car traffic, with fitful transit in the outer regions, and with a relative dearth of parkland compared to some of the very modern other cities in Europe, such as Oslo, Norway, which have been trying for decades to make themselves into these eco-cities of the future. When Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo was elected, she went about remedying that and embarking on one of the most transformative urban planning tenures of any mayor, really making Paris into a beacon for sustainability, a beacon for ecology, a beacon for a city that people have a pleasant time in, that people want to walk around in and bike in and just be in. And these transformations were, while not done for the Olympic Games in 2024 provided a target to create this fundamental transformation and revitalization of Paris by the time of the Games. One of the emblems of this ecological transformation was to make the River Seine, which had been deeply polluted, clean enough that the athletes could swim in it for the Olympics. And indeed, the river played a crucial part in the Olympics. As opposed to the standard Olympics, which is more focused on particular stadiums, particular venues, the Paris Olympics very much wanted to use Paris as the main character of the games, to really integrate Parisian landmarks and Parisian sites into the major venues. So, for instance, you have beach volleyball in the Paris Olympics right there in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower. Even the opening ceremony, which I absolutely love, it might be my favorite Olympics opening ceremony, taking place in the rain at night. All the lights illuminating the Seine as these great barges with all the athletes on it passed by, floating along. It was very dramatic and mystical and exhilarating. It completely reimagined the opening ceremonies in a way that was aligned with the game's goal of being a game's wide open, a game's that invited people to explore Paris. And a big reason why this was so successful, really integrating games into Paris, is because Paris itself had been transformed so significantly in the last 10 years. Not transformed in the bad or even very overt ways that we think of city transformation as happening. There was no, like, demolishing of these grand historic buildings or something like that. But rather, what happened is that there are a lot fewer cars in Paris than there were before. There's a lot more pedestrianized areas. There's a lot more kind of parks and riverside areas and places where humanity and nature are more freely intermingled. Now, as someone who, coming from an American context, already felt that Paris was extraordinarily soothing and serene of a city, these new transformations make it even more so. They are really remarkable. Paris is, of course, not the city most in need of such a urban planning improvement in the world, but it got one, and the results have been very much worthwhile. And this ties into Pokemon. When I saw the concept announced for Pokemon Legends ZA, how it is not set in the past, but set in the modern world, set 5 or so years after the events of Pokemon X and Y, and were very much about Paris, Lumio City, being transformed to be more open, to be more accommodating, to be more natural. With all these wild areas where Pokemon and people can interact, I instantly caught the connection to the transformations happening in real Paris in the last decade or so. This, I do not think, has been commented on enough in conversations about this game, in part because I suspect the overlap between urban planning nerds and Pokemon nerds is not the largest, but I do appreciate focusing this large game explicitly on the urban planning transformations of a major modern city. That is a challenge to make a game of, and I think that they did quite a good job of it. Yes, people have said Lumio City feels a bit constricted. Yes, people have said that there's not as much space to really wander around in as in Pokemon games of yore. We're missing all the caves and deserts and forests, but the fact that this game works at all, the fact that they managed to make a plausible Pokemon game that works as a Pokemon game that takes place in a major city entirely is very impressive. There are a lot of these wild areas where people and Pokemon interact. There's this integration of nature and the city. That is something Japanese aesthetics very much venerates, the intermingling of people and nature, the idea that nature should not be considered something overtly opposed, or even something that's very different from human civilization, but something that can coexist, that the past and the present, this ancient world and the hypermodern world, can be united. That is something that Japanese aesthetics at its best very much prizes. A place like Tokyo does not have the degree of enormous parkland as, say, Paris or some of the big Nordic cities, but it still nonetheless feels like, if you wander around Tokyo, a place where nature never feels too far away. There are these little shrines in the city, if you know where to look for them, and it just feels like a piece of the Japanese rural past that is suddenly present to you, even in the midst of a huge city. So there's already this big concern with how can humanity and the natural world fit together and not be opposed. And this is a big concern in the Pokemon franchise. So the fitting this into the urban planning transformations of modern Paris makes a strange amount of sense. It's the kind of concept that seems a bit odd, or at least seemed a bit odd to me when I was first thinking about it, but after thinking about it for a while, it is very reasonable, considering how deeply these ecological concepts, not just nature is good, but how can nature be a part of modern society, those have always been there in Pokemon, so seeing them discussed in a context like this makes sense. And just like in the real-world context, there is inevitably limitations to this. People have discussed that, oh, you're playing this game and you have these little distinct wild areas, but number one, they don't really feel truly wild. They're just little park areas. And number two, if Pokemon in their wild forms are still limited to these areas, how can you truly say it is an integration of the city and the natural environment? Which is very reasonable. And it is a critique that people have made of this modern urban planning focus on ecology, on nature, on very much bringing the forest more into the city, on bringing other animals, other species in closer contact. That, to a certain extent, this is still a tamed, kind of necessarily diminished version of the natural environment. A park is not the same as a forest. It just isn't. There are large parks, such as Central Park in New York, that very much endeavor to create this sense of the mystery and kind of romanticist wonder and strangeness of wandering through a forest. But even so, in Manhattan, you can still see the buildings ringing the park wherever you are. And that's a huge park, so these little kind of 21st century MacGyvered park areas are inevitably not the same as quote-unquote real nature. And to a certain extent, if they are to be safe places for people, they can't be. Because nature is not fully 100% safe. It just isn't. It's gorgeous, but that doesn't mean that the middle of a city can or should feel like you're wandering through this dense, kind of ancient, untouched forest land. And these are all ideas that are very present here in Legend ZA. And there is the sense, I would say above all, that navigating this relationship between the natural environment, between this larger sense of ecology and the needs of human life, that is inevitably an ongoing, incomplete project. In Legend ZA, these wild zones only exist originally because of the rogue megas that were unleashed due to mistakes and accidents that happen with the process of redeveloping and transforming the city, Lumio City, into this more ecologically focused 21st century modern city. So there's a sense that the relationship between people and between this larger ecological landscape and these idealistic impulses to bring people closer to the natural world, this is inevitably incomplete. This is inevitably an ongoing process, but that doesn't mean it's not a worthwhile one, and I think Pokemon Legends ZA actually explores that quite well. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can, and you want to see more videos just like this one. I could talk for a long time about the eco-centric redevelopment and pedestrianization and overall improvement of quality of life in modern-day Paris all day. I really am an urban planning aficionado. But above all, it's just very fun to see Pokemon take an interest in these issues. And I would say seriously consider them, or as serious as you can in this modern mainstream fantasy game. Adios, comrades.